Guys, welcome to the Hypertrophy Hustle Show. So this week I'm speaking to Eric Trexler. So Eric Trexler is one of the Stronger by Science writers or educators, and he also is on the Stronger by Science podcast. He is the host of that with his temporary guest host, Greg Knuckles. And then Eric also is now a researcher and reviewer for Mass. It's really, really cool. It's literally the only research review that I'm actually subscribed to. So that probably says something. And I was very hesitant for a while because I'm a poor student. And I was like, oh my God, do I want to spend money on this? Am I advanced for this enough yet? And then I did, and it was great and very cool. And he also just won the Stronger by Science lasagna competition, I believe. And he also got his fake netty accusation card. Very, 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 very cool achievements there. But Eric, one thing I'd like to talk to you about.
I'm sorry, I missed the second achievement there. My audio kicked out.
Oh, your fake netty accusation card. Very, very.
Oh, yeah, that was the big one.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
You cannot miss that one.
No.
But in terms of all this, one of the things that you've done really well is I've seen you explaining research a lot and sort of teaching people, okay, this is what research is, this is how you look into it. And then you'll take a paper and you'll sort of break it down into something a bit more simple. What is research for those that have no clue what I mean when I'm even talking about research? And then in terms of this, when we think about research and sort of the evidence hierarchy, what are we kind of thinking about when we're talking about those things?
Yeah, so it's good that you frame it within the context of that evidence hierarchy, because you can kind of look at this as kind of two different questions. First being, what is science? And then second, where does research fit into that whole concept? And so I view science as kind of a mindset and a process. You know, there's the scientific method where we try to use the scientific method to glean some kind of objective observations about the world around us so that we can formulate some ideas that actually withstand counter arguments. You know, it helps us separate the things we believe we know from the things we believe to be untrue. And then research is kind of the current way that we formally kind of present that to the world. It's kind of the infrastructure within which we do a lot of what we would consider formal science. So research, you're going to find it typically through the peer review journal system. And so what that often looks like is you've got researchers who typically are at either a research institute or a university. And part of their job involves doing research. They go about, they find a question that they deem to be meaningful. They develop some kind of methodology to formally test that particular research question, and they report their findings as transparently as possible and draw their conclusions from it as it relates to the question. And in the way we do research these days, and for God knows how long up till now, the peer review system is kind of a key pillar of this research process. And so it's not just that people do the research and say, go to their blog and say, hey guys, got those results for you. They submit it to an academic journal. The journal sends it to some number of peers that they trust. Possibly vet the project, make sure everything looks good and looks like it's been done rigorously. And then the research is published, and then we call it, knowledge, I guess.
Yeah, and then in terms of that, when comparing, because people often use the word research when there's something like doing something like going on Google or, I don't know, listening to a podcast, they'll call it research. And I get why they would use that word, but where does that kind of whole thing lie on the evidence hierarchy?
So there's really two different applications of the word research. So the type you're describing is kind of informal research, which is really just kind of perusing the information that's accessible and available. And what you're doing in that scenario is potentially subject to bias. You are taking some kind of random sampling of all the information on the topic available, but it's going to be biased based on what you happen to be looking for, what you happen to have access to, and the conclusions you happen to be drawing from it. So I'm not one to dismiss that type of research, but it's certainly a very different process from the kind of academic interpretation of what research is, which is a more formal process and one in which you voluntarily submit your ideas to some degree of rigorous questioning and counterargument. That theoretically, that is what the peer review process is for what we consider formal research. So it's really an informal versus formal thing. And, they both have their place when it comes to the overall process, I guess. There's people who are in the formal academic setting who are creating new research and trying to disseminate it. There's the people who are like the first line of folks that are actually reading that source material and relaying that to the broader public. And then finally, there's the broader public who may be looking at the original document, but might just be looking at secondary reports about the research and aggregating that to inform their understanding of whatever this topic is.
Yeah.
So they're very different levels of what we would consider academic inquiry.
Yeah, and I think commonly the thing that I'm still sort of trying to understand is, okay, we have research papers, right? But for some people, I'd say most people, they're pretty difficult to interpret, and I guess the word interpret safely might play in there, because you can get one paper and you might get all the smart people who interpret it one way, and then you might get someone else who has no academic background who'll read it, and then they'll think. So I think you might get someone else who has no academic background, who hasn't sort of learned how to read research, who tries to read it and interpret it, and then they can kind of be left with different conclusions. Like, do you find that's commonly the case, and like what ways can we use to get around that? Should most people be trying to interpret research, or is it kind of, hey, if you don't know what's going on, I'd be very wary?
So that's a really good question. And do you mind if I kind of go off in a somewhat long story about this?
For sure.
Because this is very important to me. So when I was working on my PhD, I had the opportunity to teach the class that I always teach, which was very easy because I'd already taught it. So I had all the slides, I had the quizzes, the tests, whatever. You make some changes, but generally speaking, I've taught this thing before. It's easy. I could do it. And I opted in to actually build a course from scratch, which was a lot more work. It took a lot of time and effort. And what we did was I teamed up. I was doing regular kind of what most people would consider typical exercise and nutrition research, where we were doing interventions in the laboratory. Give the person a workout, see how they react to it. Give them some supplement, see how they react. Now, I teamed up with an epidemiologist, purely doing observational research. And I teamed up with a computational physicist. So all of her experiments took place in very, very powerful computers based on parameters that she was putting in. And so it was three completely different types of research. And the whole premise of the course was it was for first-year university students. So these are 18-year-old kids for the most part.
Yeah.
And the whole concept was how the course is about scientific literacy. So introducing the concept of science, teaching them kind of what research is, how it's done, and how to interpret it, but more importantly, how to interpret the way journalists write about it. So we talked about not just how research is done, but also how it's spoken about and written, and how it kind of passes from person to person in kind of a game of telephone. And it was tricky because it was really illuminating to me. When I started the process, my concept was everybody should be going to the journal, getting the full text, reading it, and making their own interpretation. I no longer believe that to be true. Because what I found was, when you start interacting with people outside of your field, I've published a lot of research in my area. But when my friend Casey would give me a computational physics paper that we were going to speak about in class, here. Like theoretically, I know how to read research, but research takes so many different forms, and it has so many different requirements for very topic specific expertise. So I have a kind of revised view of what we should really realistically hope for people to do, because I shouldn't be reading primary computational physics research because I don't know what I'm doing with it at all.
Neither.
And so my new revised approach is I do think there's a baseline level of scientific literacy that's pretty critical that everyone should have. And what that involves is knowing, how do I react to a paper that was done in mice versus monkeys versus humans? How do I react to a paper that was observational versus one that was an actual, tightly controlled intervention?
Yeah.
So there are some key scientific principles that people should be aware of and have a full understanding of. But I don't think it is realistic to ask people. I mean, so I'm a peer reviewer, or at least in the past, I've reviewed for several journals. And there are many times where a journal will send me a paper. I'll look at what they've sent me and I'll say, thanks for reaching out. I don't think I'm the right person to review this paper. There are people with better expertise in this area to review this paper. And when you turn a paper down like that, you're like, should we be asking people who don't have much experience within the field to be going out into papers that are published and kind of drawing their own conclusions?
Yeah.
And because if I don't feel comfortable doing that just a little bit outside of my scope of expertise,
if I'm
how are
trying
we
to
going
go
to
and read a physics paper, it's like, bro, that's a joke. Like I won't understand half the words on there.
Exactly. So my new revised stance is we should equip people with kind of a baseline level of scientific literacy. We should absolutely help them see, where does research fit into this hierarchy of evidence? Why should we value research and certain types of research over others? But when it comes to getting into the actual text itself, I think there is a smaller percentage of the global population that would be spending their time well by doing that. Yeah. And that's not me saying, oh, it's only for the academics, leave that to us. Like, it's not some weird ego thing, because there's of the entire global pool of research that's out there, I am only equipped to really thoroughly read about this much of it, just like the tiniest little percentage that falls within the scope of my training as a researcher. So if it's not within my little area of expertise, to dive in and get really nuanced perspective on that particular paper. So I think it's important that the people who do have that expertise in their area actually use it in a helpful way. And so that is one of the reasons why, when I was looking at different career options coming out of my PhD, I said, I want to be one of the people who, in my area of expertise, can go into the journals, have a decent nuanced interpretation, write that in a way that's readable, understandable, and can actually be applied to how people train and eat. We need some of those people who are in that middle ground, who say, I'm equipped to go in and figure out what's going on in here and give you kind of an objective summary of what's happening. Yeah. But so that's my thing, is that, like I said, it's not an ego thing. Everyone here is smart enough. Anyone who's listening to this podcast, I guarantee, is as smart as me. They're absolutely smart enough to go spend 10 years in college and learn how to do this in a formal way. But I'm the only one dumb enough to do that. Spend 10 years of my life doing that.
Do you feel like there's too many landmines people don't see? It's for my ability to look at a paper and be like, this is a good paper, this is a bad paper, is non-existent. I have no clue if it's a reputable paper with the limitations are obvious. Like, the one places I can look, okay, study size and funding. That's pretty much all I know.
Yeah. So, okay, I have made some jokes at my own expense. Now I will give myself a little bit of credit. There are some landmines that a lot of people don't see. Yeah. And so that's why what we do is valuable. And that's why I wake up every day excited about doing it. Yeah. There is a lot of stuff. I mean, there was one paper where even the reviewers missed a really, really critical detail. And I mean, we're talking about it was a big deal, so you look at the way that they constructed their statistical models, and they were probably completely covering up an effect that was likely to be there because of the way that they use covariates in the model.
Yeah, was this the one you and Greg were talking about recently, I think, on mass?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I remember this.
Yeah. So without getting too super specific, what they did was they had their effect that they were trying to look at, basically their research question, and they included a covariate in the model that almost certainly severely shrunk or minimized the impact of the effect they were trying to study.
Right.
And I don't think it jumped out to them at the time. I think it very much influenced some of the conclusions of the paper. And so, yeah, there are, because I'm dumb enough to go to college for 10 years and, miss out on all the other fun stuff that was going on the last decade, I have been trained to find some of these landmines and to faithfully report them back to you and say, I know that the conclusion of that paper says this. However, I'm of the opinion that it actually is probably a little bit different than that. And so that actually happens more often than you would think in mass. So with mass, it's our monthly publication where we review studies, and we review the ones that, frankly, we think are most interesting and useful. So if you're into getting stronger, bigger, leaner, or performing better, we're probably going to cover what you like because it's what we like.
Yeah, and it's usually they're not like how to gain size. Like, it's a lot more specific, and it's like you can literally search on it and be like hypertrophy, and then you get all the articles under hypertrophy. And it's like, for instance, I was reading Greg's article, I think, on sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and I was like, what the fuck is that? I had no clue that even existed. And then I was sort of reading it, and I was like, okay, this is it. This is how important it is. This, I think he was talking about a paper that touched on it. It was very, yeah, it's very highly recommend. Little plug.
Well, thank you. But more often, you'd be surprised how often it is that we review a study in mass, and the authors of the paper have a particular conclusion, and we look at it and we're like, I just don't see it that way, and we kind of detail why we think the outcome should be either modified or, in some cases, completely the other direction.
This is what kind of scares me. It's kind of like, okay, how much of research is incorrect? And it's like, this is the best tool we have to get to truth.
It's a valid concern. Now, research is a broad term, right?
Yeah.
There are some fields of research that are farther along than others in terms of how rigorously they do science.
Right.
And so I had a mentor, still have a mentor. He teaches me a ton of stuff, but he's a statistician, and he's worked in different fields throughout his career. He just kind of goes from, hey, who needs a statistician? And then he's in that field for a while. And I was telling him, I was like, there's some research I'm seeing coming out in these journals that I just don't think is very good. And he's like, it's probably not. Because when he got involved in the nursing field as a statistician, he's like, you wouldn't believe what they were calling research. It was horrible.
Shit.
And they started borrowing a lot of techniques from the biomedical research and really improving their methods, really improving their teaching, how they were teaching their researchers coming through their PhD programs. Infinitely further along than it could be. And I think exercise science, even in my short time within the field, I've seen a lot of growth. If you saw the most recent issue of Mass, I don't remember if I said this on the podcast. I think I said it on the Stronger by Science podcast. But Grant Tinsley's time-restricted feeding paper, I said, this does not look like an exercise science paper. And that is awesome. I was like, this looks like it's straight from like a very high-tier medical journal in terms of the rigor and all the details that they incorporated into it. So yeah, just because a paper makes it into a journal doesn't mean that it's necessarily perfect. Actually, it's probably not perfect, but getting into a journal means it was good enough for that journal as determined by probably 2 or 3 people.
Wow.
So
it can... slip through a
Yeah,
little bit.
the peer review process is limited. You basically send it off to 2 or 3 people. They take a look at it. Theoretically, they should be able to catch any major issues and ask for clarification or revision. But these are people that are humans and they miss things. And so, and some journals have higher standards than others.
Yeah,
I mean, you're going to find that in every field.
Yeah.
So exercise. I don't mean to bash exercise science. It's the field I'm in. So I mean, it's the pot calling the kettle black, right? Like I'm part of this research field too. So we're getting better over time, and we're borrowing things from other fields, and the rigor I think is getting better. But it's a good point you bring up. That is, just because something got published in a journal does not mean that it's like, well, I don't know, paper said it and somebody said it was accurate, so it must be fine. There really needs to be people who have training in the field who are looking at the stuff after it's published and saying that's not the way I see it, you know.
Yeah.
And it doesn't, you know, just because we have a slightly different conclusion doesn't mean that somebody was wrong. It's just we look at it from a different, we might see it from a different perspective, and we might say they're technically right, but like there's nothing wrong with what they did, but their interpretation of it, of how they would apply it, doesn't add up because of some other stuff that, you know, that we explain.
I don't know. I was having a conversation with one of my lecturers the other day, and they were kind of like, hey, they basically went along the lines of saying, and this is one of my lecturers in podiatry, so it's a different field altogether, and podiatry is a tiny field, so, but they never really have told us, the research in podiatry is good or bad or whatever. They just kind of give us the research, and then, but they were kind of saying, their argument was kind of like, it was a bit pessimistic in a way. It was kind of like, oh, you can't trust researchers because they were basically a bit pessimistic in a way. They were saying you can't trust researchers because they're a bit biased. They say that they all fudge numbers. They're all these arguments for why we kind of can't put much weight and evidence at all, and it kind of, I don't know, I was kind of like, that can't really be the case, because if we're trying to make an evidence-based medical or fitness practice, if we can't trust evidence, then how can we trust anything? Like, I don't know what else we can trust. Like, I guess pure anecdote, but it's kind of like that again has a shit ton of flaws. Do you think like those arguments have any credence?
I'm with you. So I'm not naive. I'm a pretty cynical guy. So I'm not naive enough to say, well, if it's research, surely everyone's being perfectly honest and rigorous. But I really don't. I would disagree. I don't think there are that many bad actors out there. I don't think there are many people at all that are intentionally fudging things or trying to sway the research in one direction or another. And we have seen that in exercise science, those individuals, it's usually pretty easy to tell. I mean, it's not hard. So I would disagree that it's like, there's no chance, everybody's lying. I don't see that to be the case. I mean, there's a lot of really good actors in the exercise science and nutrition science space. And you know, there's huge ramifications for the people that are not acting in good faith, and they usually get exposed, and that's usually a pretty terrible thing for them. So I think there's several deterrents in place. And more importantly, I kind of default to your interpretation, which is research isn't perfect. Like I said, peer review is not perfect. Researchers themselves are not infallibly honest 100% of the time. I think it's a very high percentage, but it's not a inherently perfect system, but it is, if you have something better in terms of eliminating bias, enhancing objectivity, I'd love to hear it. But I don't think you can, aside from improving the process that we have in place with some incremental changes, and you know, you could go back and forth about, do we need to revamp the way we do peer-reviewed publishing? Probably, yes. So I'm not saying it can't get better, but if you're saying, no, throw out the whole research process, let's find something else that's better, then we're taking several steps back, because we used to do that. We used to just whoever had the most convincing anecdote won. And usually what happens there is the most profitable one someone will find a way to make it very convincing,
Right.
and they'll dupe a lot of people, and a lot of people get hurt in the process. So
Yeah.
be very cautious about throwing out the entire concept just because every now and then we get burned and find out that somebody was acting in a nefarious way.
Yeah, I don't know. I always it's kind of I find it too pessimistic of an argument to say that all research is useless. It's like that obviously can't be the case, because why would we then have an evidence-based medical system? Like, it's kind of like, okay, then what on earth do we form? Like, we used to have a medical, as you said, like a medical system based on anecdotes. It's like, here, take this herb, see if it cures your cancer. It's like, no, like, how about we do a meta-analysis, see what works? It's like, yeah.
And that's the thing that is really annoying is we have ways to do meta science now. So if you, and this is what's really funny about it, is as research gets more transparent because of technological advances, we have the ability to make research more transparent than ever. And as that happens, we have more of an ability to do meta science and to take a step back and say, in this field of research, do we see areas where we perceive that there's anything fraudulent or any kind of bias going on? And I mean, the field of meta science is essentially its own field of trying to figure out how do we use the data that's coming out to monitor the science and make sure it's being done well in an unbiased manner.
Meaning kind of like evaluating the efficacy of research.
So like, think of it this way, like people are doing meta-analyses, right?
Yeah.
But who figured out how to do it?
Right.
Those are the meta scientists.
Well, who figured out why the evidence hierarchy, or why it is
right. So there are people out there who are saying we need to develop tools to assess bias for meta-analyses.
Right. Okay.
We need to figure out statistical techniques to combine results from several different studies.
Right.
There are people who are really focused in on how do we do legitimate, robust, quantitative oversight
Yeah.
of the research that's occurring, and you can apply it to several different fields. So that's what I mean. There might be some other application of the term meta science. I don't know. But to me, that's what it means, is the people who are interested in how we basically oversee the rigor of science that's occurring and how do we actually do meta-analyses and things of that nature.
With meta-analyses, I have an anecdote that I've shared many times on this podcast, but I won't. It's basically my lecturer doesn't think calories control weight loss, and then I was like, "What the fuck? Like, do you have any?" I didn't approach it the best. I wish I approached it more diplomatic. I was kind of like, "What on earth? Oh my god!" And then I just got mad, and then basically they were like, "Hey, here's these random diseases where something or other." Basically, they didn't believe in calories in, calories out, and I was like, "Okay, do you have any research or any evidence at all?" And they were like, "No, not really." Like, they just mentioned a few case studies, and I was like, "Okay." So then later that night, I sent them a meta-analysis, but then it's like, do you think how much credence? Because I guess it does depend on the meta-analysis, and it does depend on where it's coming from, and just because it's a meta-analysis doesn't mean it is truth. It's just maybe higher likelihood that we might be more correct. Is that about right?
I wouldn't even say that. It's so meta-analysis is a topic that it's near and dear to my heart. I took a course on it with somebody who's got a lot of insight on meta-analysis. He's been teaching it since he was like an early adopter of the concept of like how do we like modernize meta-analysis. Because I mean the first kind, what many people call the first meta-analysis, was done on the typhoid fever vaccine. I think it was by Carl Pearson, maybe, but it was decades and decades and decades ago. But I actually, fun fact, I'm pretty sure the conclusion that it reached was erroneous. I think later they found it to be the opposite. But I'm going way deep in the memory here, so don't fact check me on that, or do fact check me, but don't say I intentionally misled you. But so with meta-analysis, all it is we kind of try to find these tools that are blunt instruments to try to compile the results from many different studies. Sometimes those meta-analyses are awful, because they're combining studies that really cannot be combined in a logical way.
Right.
Or they're combining studies that can be combined in a logical way, but they're using really poor methods to try to do the analysis.
Right.
So meta-analysis is a whole kind of concept of studies that can be done well and can be done very poorly. So a meta-analysis done extremely well is kind of, as you indicated, like this is a very solid cumulative look at a body of research. Like theoretically, you could say that the goal of a body of research is to do several well-done studies that will contribute to a well-done meta-analysis that will paint a beautiful picture of the topic, and we will say, perfect, we did it, let's put that aside, and we'll move on to the next problem. Like you could view it that way, and in that sense is the valid, robust way to summarize that entire body of literature if it's done well. But there are some meta-analyses that aren't done super well. So that's why I always hesitate to immediately make them like the king of the evidence pyramid there that everybody draws. I was looking at a meta-analysis the other day. I'm not going to say what it was on because I don't want to like completely shame the people that wrote it. But the way that they claimed to calculate effect size was not an effect size by any stretch of the imagination. There was no way you could argue that that number that they listed had anything to do with an effect size, no matter how generous you want to be about the definition of effect or size or the combination of effect and size. It just wasn't that. It was the equation for something, but it was a completely different concept that was not useful to the research question. So the two options are they actually did calculate that as they said, and that entire paper was useless. I mean, completely meaningless. The other option is they did do the meta-analysis correctly, but they wrote their equation wrong, and they also defined effect size with a nonsense definition that is not what it means. And in that case, we are trusting that they did every other step of the process well, but still aren't thorough enough to put like the main equation of their entire paper into the paper. So,
right.
It's either...
Is it common that they will exclude the equation? Because I guess like most people won't understand it, but it's kind of like you should probably put it in there. Is that the...
I think you should put it in there. If you're doing a meta-analysis that is purely predicated on the effect size measurement, you should tell people, or you don't have to give the equation, but you should at least say specific. There are many kinds of effect sizes that are justifiable, and so that's why if you just say, well, I calculated the effect size, and you don't have any more detail, people are going to say, well, what does that mean? I mean, there's even if you say Cohen's d, that's not enough detail. There's all sorts of ways to calculate something that you could call a Cohen's d value. So even if you don't write out the equation, you should at least say, by the way, I used this particular type of effect size. The problem was they included an equation, but the equation was for something, but it was not an effect size by anyone's definition. And that's coming from a person who said, yeah, you can probably define effect size at least 50 different ways. Well, this was none of those 50. So the problem there was they either miscalculated or, I mean, with a meta-analysis, the whole purpose is thorough, rigorous attention to detail. It's gathering the data from all these different studies and very meticulously putting it together. And so it really rocks your confidence in the findings that have poor attention to detail in a very important way, or they might have just calculated something that isn't what it is. So that's just a little anecdote, but yeah, sometimes you'll see a meta-analysis and you'll think, oh, great, a meta-analysis is here. Now we know the answer. And then you look into the methods of the meta-analysis and you're like, this was a really bad way to combine these studies.
Does this kind of often get people trapped? Like it's kind of like it's like with this stuff, we can never truly have the truth, which kind of sucks. It's like we can get pretty close, but it's kind of like we always kind of, it's like the more I get into this stuff, the more I kind of feel as though we can never reach the absolute truth. Like there's nothing we can be 100% certain with, which is kind of like fuck, you know?
Well, I think there's two different ways to look at it. So when we're talking about researchers who maybe misinterpret their own data or make mistakes or even are acting fraudulently on purpose, that's a different thing.
Yeah.
Because there's always going to be bad people and there's always going to be wrong people. So that shouldn't threaten our confidence in our quest toward an objective truth. But there is a bigger point there that I assume you were alluding to, which is research and the understanding that we obtain from research is a living, changing thing. There's always some kind of nuance that we can adjust and say, okay, well, now we understand how this works in this particular scenario with, trained females, not sedentary, not male, that are doing this type of exercise in the fasted state. And that's just a random collection of, little caveats you can put onto a claim.
Yeah.
But the general idea is, especially in exercise and nutrition science, you're right. We're not going to have a single intervention where we say, oh, turns out carbs were bad, just across the board, right? It's just not going to work that way. It's going to be, it looks like in this particular subset of the population, in this very specific scenario, we now have a pretty good understanding of the pros and cons of carbohydrate.
Right.
And that informs the way we address carbohydrate. It might change in 50 years, but not because the changes are usually incremental. It's usually that we're ever refining and tweaking our understanding. It's usually not that we have this huge body of research that was replicated and tested by all these different labs, and they all converged at this conclusion, and then we just figure out one day way off. That's usually not how it works. It's usually that, there's a little nuance to that particular understanding that we simply didn't account for, and when you account for that, it becomes a much more complicated picture.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't become super disheartened. Like I said, there's a lot more. Most researchers are acting in good faith.
Yeah.
And when I say most, I mean by a long shot. There are very few people out there with nefarious intentions. There are very few people out there that are like super incompetent and just completely messing up all their studies. Usually what it looks like is people that are working with very good intentions, that are well trained, doing a nice job. And it's just in the little nuances of the study that someone like me or Greg or Mike or the other Eric that we don't talk about, the other Eric.
Yeah. I think his name's Derek, right?
I think so. But it's in the little nuances that we say, before you apply this to your situation, here's something really important to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So it's very rare that we're going to review a study for mass or for Stronger by Science or for whatever, and we go, looks like fraud again. Like that's not the typical scenario. But it's usually, here's a finding that was real, and this is what happened. But what they're talking about in the discussion about how this applies to you as a powerlifter, maybe it doesn't apply to you as a powerlifter because of these reasons.
Yeah. So so it's not like we should be overly pessimistic about, okay, we can never actually reach the truth. Okay, let's just not pursue anything. It's like that's probably not the best way to go about it. But then, is there any way, what makes you confident personally that most researchers are good? Like, is it the nature of that career? It's like, I guess, when you're pursuing higher education and research and going to get your PhD to do a degree that is primarily for research, do you feel like that usually takes a kind of person who just wants to answer questions, not be fraudulent, or is that somewhere along the lines?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to answer that. The easiest way, I mean, I've been interacting with researchers for my entire adult life, and I've never personally interacted with one where I was like, that person, I just do not trust them. Right. I have seen stories where there's a particular researcher, you see a couple of studies out of their lab, and you go, yeah, I don't believe any of that. but it's such a small percentage,
Yeah.
such a small percentage. And when it happens, it's you find out because everyone in the field is pretty good at what they do.
Yeah.
And so everyone in the field that's doing research is looking at these like the human body generally acts, and that ain't it.
Yeah.
So, and now there's people that are finding even more advanced metrics to look at studies and say, there's no way these numbers are real. There's too much, there's people who know a lot more about math than I do, who are looking at numbers and saying, there's no way that this pattern of numbers occurred in nature, period, that someone's tweaking these. Yeah. So there's the fact that people, if it was super rampant, we would just figure it out because ultimately we're in the business of publishing stuff and putting it out in public. And so when you do that, it's open to scrutiny and people can tell. And another thing that you were getting to is if you wanted to be a charlatan and just, be a complete fraudster and turn misinformation into wealth, you're not going to do it as a researcher at a university. I promise you that. There are like if you true. I mean, believe me, people that are taking like university researcher jobs, if they got fired from their research job, I'm not fired because then, they might have done something wrong, but if they left their research job and took a job in the sport nutrition, sports science industry, they would be taking a huge pay raise. They're usually working at a lower wage than they could command in the market because they really care about this stuff and they like doing the research. So it's a labor of love. It's something that they take seriously. Yeah. And, they view their ethical code when it comes to research and instructing students as an extremely important thing. I mean, they've basically, they didn't go take a university professor job to get remarkably wealthy in the field of sports science. Now, if you're a researcher over in the Department of Surgery or, some really highly funded field where there's a lot of intellectual property running through universities and they have to pay a lot of money to keep you around. Yeah, they actually get paid. I mean, they make some money. But
so why do people do you think, say if you're not insanely passionate about research or you don't have this burning desire to answer a few questions, what would there be? It's kind of, would you say it's would there be some prerequisites you should probably meet before trying to some moral or I don't know, prerequisites where in yourself you're like, fuck, I have to do this? Does it need to be that feeling?
The general question is why
go into research unless you're extremely do you feel like that's the only situation you should go into it where it consumes you?
Honestly, I mean that I have such a profound respect for people that go into research. It's a labor of love. I think people go into it because they care about it. They're passionate about it. They think their work is important. And, for people that take full-time academic positions, it's because one of the things that may contribute, aside from their passion for it, they love research, they love teaching, they love being in the university atmosphere. A lot of times those jobs are very stable, which is a nice thing for some people. There's a lot of good reasons to want to be, an exercise science, sport nutrition type professor. But the reason that you would not do it is because the cash is just too good and the incentive to commit fraud is too high. I mean, that's just such a horrible reason to go into it, because if you wanted to be that snake oil salesman, just go sell snake oil.
Instagram.
You're gonna make 1 million times more money, and the university won't be breathing down your neck. So I don't think that within the university walls is where you're gonna find these people that are trying to sell out research for a quick buck. But it is a labor of love. So right now, my full-time stuff I do is, for Stronger by Science, I do the podcast and writing, and I coach. And for Mass, I do the research reviews every month. But I'm still doing academic research, and I make $0 for it. Actually, it actually costs me a tiny bit of money to do it, because sometimes we publish in open access journals, and I'll be like, yeah, I'll contribute to the cost to publish.
Wow.
So I make nothing from it. I have no intellectual properties that I could try to, once we publish this, we can go file a patent. It brings me nothing aside from the gratification of knowing that we've contributed to knowledge in the area.
Wow.
And if anything, I have to put down work that I actually make money on and say, all right, I'm done with my work day. It's like, 6, 7 at night. And instead of, going and doing something that a normal, well-adjusted person would do for fun, I open up my other laptop and I start working on, on research. So, there are a few bad actors here and there, but they get noticed pretty easily, I think.
Do you feel like it's common that it's not like, one, you have to like get into the field and then commit to being fraudulent, and it's just I feel like it's just this massive conspiracy theory that all, like, the theory that research just is all fraudulent and all fixed is like, do you feel like in some fields that could be the case, or it's more likely in some fields, or pretty much never?
That a huge proportion of the research is just completely fraudulent?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I mean, my thing is, I think it's much more likely within certain fields that, I think it's likely within any field that any researcher is going to kind of bring their own unintentional bias to the table.
Yeah.
So if you were to tell me a lot of the research is interpreted in a slightly biased way that might oversell certain conclusions, or might find a conclusion and say, don't worry about that because it doesn't fit how I kind of view this concept.
Right.
I'd get on board with that. People in many cases struggle to separate their objective interpretation of their results from kind of their preconceived idea of how this study would go. I think those are things that are always going to be present. And two people can look at the same exact study and have different conclusions. And that's a healthy discussion. That's not, how do we get this out of the field? That's just, hey, the data are here. Let's have a discussion about what they mean. Yeah. Usually everybody learns in the process and we're all good. No, I don't. Again, I told you I'm really cynical, but I'm not that cynical. I really don't believe that there's a lot of people out there who are like, I mean, especially in our field. Think about what that would mean, that somebody's out there saying, no, think about this. When you look at like the majority of the research in our field, there's somebody out there who's going, I am going to swindle the entire world into thinking that if you add 3 high-intensity interval sessions to your resistance training program, you're going to observe an interference effect, but not if you add 2. Good luck. I mean, if that is your, that's going to be the thing that you decide to somehow monetize and print money off of that. Like, come on. Most of the research in our field, it's like there's just no incentive to be that shady, and I think there's too many really, really good people doing research for me to have that cynical of a view.
Especially in like bodybuilding or powerlifting, right? It's like, okay, if we can literally combat it with like a shit, like I think this is a place where it's like anecdotes would just be like, what? Like everyone would just be like, hold up, like that doesn't match anything I've ever seen. No other coach has seen anything like that. It's kind of, I don't know. It's good to hear that we're not in this. It's good to hear that we're not in this like conspiracy theory of research where we can't trust, and then we can actually never reach truth in its purest form. So I'm glad to hear that's not the case.
Yeah. Now the one thing I would like to see, the one thing that does, again, this isn't people doing anything horrible, but I think one thing that would benefit the exercise science field, this is something that I've been vocal about forever. I'm biased. This is a biased opinion, but I think that we have a lot of room to grow as a field when it comes to statistical analysis. I think one of the things that one of the real value items I bring when I review a study is because I just really like stats and I read about it a lot. A lot of times I'll catch something statistically that is not a huge deal. It's rarely going to implode the entire study or completely switch the conclusions. But yeah, I think the field overall would benefit from taking statistical training a little bit more seriously with our students.
Yeah.
So I think we're getting there. I think I'm seeing more things in exercise science papers that statistically are really, really nicely done. There are more people that are taking a keen interest in statistical methods in the field. So I think we're already improving it. But yeah, that is the one thing where it's like, it's tough because you're like, so Eric, is everybody out there committing fraud and lying all the time? And I'm like, I don't think so. And then it's like, well, then why should I read your stupid research review every month? And it's because I think the areas where things like a research review are useful are how can you be certain that the researchers accounted for everything they should have accounted for? How can you be sure that they're interpreting it for the kind of person that we write to with Mass and Stronger by Science? You kind of interpret it with a particular population in mind.
Yeah.
So did they account for everything? Did they interpret it appropriately? And more importantly, for us, the general population that we are reading this. And are there any little nuances that they might have potentially overlooked or even in some cases maybe messed up that are worthy of consideration, noteworthy things that you might find? So some of the statistical things that I tend to catch, it's like, that could have been done better, but look at the results. It's not going to change a thing, but every now and then you do find something where you go, ooh, well, that's interesting.
What do you
I don't
do
know.
in that case? Like you'll talk about it. You'll talk about it en masse and sort of explain what's an issue with it. But then, is there anything you can do after that point? Like I messaged Greg a while ago and I was like, what does it mean when a paper has been, I think it was redacted or it's been basically discontinued, I think.
Yeah. So sometimes when flaws are big enough in a paper, it will be retracted.
All right.
And so they'll basically issue a statement and say, hey, sorry, somebody noticed some pretty big flaws in this. We're going to go ahead and take it down. And a lot of times you see that. When people are kind of caught being pretty fraudulent.
Right,
And
okay.
so what'll happen is a lot of times somebody will be like, all right, enough is enough. This person, they finally went a little too far in a paper and people noticed this is not real. And then they start going back into all their previous work and finding out, oh, okay, so this is kind of the thing you've been doing. So retractions are a thing, but usually retractions are reserved for really catastrophic stuff.
So if you've seen something that's been retracted, it's probably a good idea to disregard most of what the study is all the study conclusions. Probably.
Now, there are instances where you'll see retractions that are really just more to be on the safe side. So they won't come out and say like, oh, this we know for certain that this thing's fraudulent, but it's like, well, people raise concerns about it and we can't really verify one way or the other because the records weren't kept well enough or something like that. So not every retraction is exactly the same. Sometimes people will just say, hey, we published this paper 3 years ago. We found an error in our analysis. Just one of our colleagues asked, how we did this, and we realized we forgot to carry the 2. And so sometimes people will say, we're going to take this down because we don't want people to be planning new studies based on it.
Right.
So there are some instances where a retraction is just a good faith actor who's in research saying, oh, no, we made a mistake. We just caught it. Please let us take that back. We'll address it.
Reissue it, or would they correct it and then do that sometimes? Or
It depends. Sometimes they'll tell the journal, "Hey, I'd like to issue a correction," and then the editor kind of makes a decision of is this small enough to warrant a correction, or should we just bring the whole thing down? And if
Yeah.
you want to resubmit it to our journal or some other journal, then you can go that route.
Right.
But usually with the retraction, so it's going to be a pretty serious measure that people take. It's not like I was reading your discussion and I disagree with your interpretation of this one little part of the paper. That's not how it works. It'd be, a retraction worthy thing would be, I ran some calculations on your data and it's physically impossible. That would be you retract that. But even for something like, I was looking at your models and you included a covariate that I don't think you should have. They didn't. That's kind of an opinion thing,
Right. Okay.
They could very easily say, no, we want the covariate in there, and I'd be like, well, I disagree pretty strongly, and that's fine. But so yeah, the thing, usually retractions are done when there's some kind of fraudulent component, or there's been a very noteworthy error that makes it such that this information is doing more harm than good. It's not like a choice that was made that was clearly reported that it's just like, I wish they didn't make that choice.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, theoretically, if you found something that you thought was really terrible, you could email the journal and be like, hey, you guys might want to consider either asking them to correct it or just retracting the paper. But even like the meta-analysis example I brought up, where I was like, that's not the equation that's not even close to the equation they should have been using. Realistically, I'd have to go back and check if it mattered, in terms of like, you could probably back calculate some things and figure out what equation they really used. But more importantly, there was no reason to calculate the effect size in the first place. So like, the meta-analysis was aimed at answering an incredibly obvious question. So like,
does creatine work, or does creatine?
Oh no, I'm saying
I know. Like,
way more obvious.
Like, ridiculously, like, does hypertrophy occur from resistance training?
Yeah,
Like,
I mean,
that
it was.
level of...
It was even worse. Yeah, it was worse than that in terms of just how blatantly obvious. So for that reason, I'm like, you know what? We could try to. You could say, hey, can you clarify this equation? But the reality is, for all intents and purposes, that equation didn't matter a damn thing.
Right.
But it's still like, it's kind of, for people like us that have some training in the area that can catch this stuff. It's still, when it's useful information, it's a good idea to put up a post or an article or cover it in mass or something and say, if we see something where it's like, oh, people are going to misapply this, or people are going to misinterpret this, and it's going to actually start affecting how they do training or diet or whatever, then you go in and you say, hey, we got to bring some attention to this. But a particular thing is like, nobody cares. Just, it's not going to affect anybody whatsoever.
Yeah, it's the world of research, I think, is scary and complicated, but I think it's I don't know, I think it's inspiring for me, because it's like, I would love to do research at some point, but it's like probably two-ish years away. I want to do my master's next year and then do it, and then there's like shit tons of questions I want to answer, but I think I want to make sure I understand the ramifications of what research actually is before I go and idealize it and think, okay, I'm going to be answering all these amazing questions, and it's going to be, the easy pursuit of truth. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that, and I think that's probably a good thing for, like, even I think the more you get into it, the more you realize how we kind of had to take some things with a grain of salt, but you can still get to the point where you've basically said, okay, this thing is probably correct in this situation for the most case, which is cool to see, because then it takes us a few steps closer to absolute truth. But,
and this goes back to something we were chatting about kind of way at the beginning, but what is research? And we've talked a little bit about, well, if there's some chance that research is erroneous, should we just default to anecdote? In reality, research, I'm going to get very philosophical here, research is a natural, organized extension of anecdote. So you might be doing something and you say, you know what, I've got a few clients that seem to be responding really well to this. And then the question is, well, how do you know for sure that it's not just your eyes playing tricks on you? You say, well, we could think of a good way to actually measure that outcome. And we could actually test it, and we could control all the other things that might be influencing that. And we could set it up as an experiment. And instead of having one observation that fails to account for all these other factors, we make several observations that actually proactively control for everything that might also be explaining it. And so all you've tried to do is organize what seemed to be an anecdotal observation, but make that observation many times over in a scenario where you've tried to eliminate other factors that might be clouding your perspective or your perception of that. Right. And you've basically just set up an experiment.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a cool way to outline it, because it's kind of like, hey, like I remember I was on podiatry placement and we were like, okay, to treat verrucas, potentially we think, I can't remember what the treatment was. It was, what's that? Liquid nitrogen, and we were using an acid as well, I believe. Don't quote me on that. If you treat verrucas, don't do that. I don't know.
I'm never going to quote anybody about podiatry. I promise you.
Yeah. So basically,
and that, not to slight podiatry, it's just I have no business in it.
Exactly. Yeah. And we were just like, oh, that seems. We just kind of thought, hey, this seems to work a little bit better than just using one. And then the podiatrist couldn't see any drawbacks to using both. So then we were kind of thinking, okay, why don't we try it on a few patients? Maybe not, maybe that's not exactly a study, but it's like it was a bit closer rather than just one patient. And we saw it work quite well over a few patients, and it was kind of, we couldn't find, before we did this, we looked online to see, okay, is there anything that contraindicates using these two treatments together? And then it's like, okay, so far as we can see, no. So then effectively, why not? And I think the why not was kind of more of a money thing rather than a danger or lack of utility thing, which was cool. And then, I don't know. I don't think we're actually going to try and put this into a paper, but it was kind of like, okay, why don't we do this? Because they're both pretty cheap methods. It's just, I think people just pick one and run with it instead of doing both. But yeah, it's no one will probably know what the fuck I'm talking about, but a verruca is like a virus. And effectively, we debride it and then we treat it with that stuff. And then, yeah, that's just a way we were thinking of enhancing the treatment of it, because they don't heal at all. Well, it takes ages, and some guy will have it for 10 years, kind of shit. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. But yeah, should we end off here, Eric? Where can people find you? Where can people find Mass? Where can people find Stronger by Science, or you anywhere on the internet?
Yeah, so I'll give that information, and can I get one more closing statement?
Go on, yeah.
Okay, so you can find me at strongerbyscience.com. You can also find me every month. We put out an issue of Mass, which can also be found at strongerbyscience.com. And if you want to look into subscribing to that, I'm on Facebook and on Instagram. My handle is at Trexler Fitness. I'm on Twitter, but I never use it because people are very mean on Twitter. So that's where you can find me. And also we do the Stronger by Science podcast. It goes out every Thursday on like every podcast platform.
Yeah, and I'd just like to jump in. It's a very good podcast. Like, it's fucking hilarious, which is fun, but it's also intelligent. So it's not just funny. And I find that's the common issue, is you'll have a podcast that's funny, but then they have nothing to add. And you guys will teach while not being boring as fuck, which is just fantastic.
Yeah, and I said earlier that like everybody listening to this is probably as smart as me. You're probably not as smart as Greg, though. Greg is like really, really, really smart. So it's fun to do the podcast with him. So my closing statement, we talked a lot about research, and research means a lot to me. And it's something that's still a really important part of my life, doing research myself, looking at other people's research and reporting it. I don't want it to seem like an inaccessible thing. But the one thing that I would kind of reiterate is the reason that we think what we do is important and valuable, of whether it's for free on Stronger by Science or you subscribe to Mass or whatever, there is a lot of technical detail that it's just not reasonable to think that everyone will go and spend 6, 8, 10 years of dedicated study looking into all these factors and nuances. And so one of the things we're really proud of is that we are willing to do that for you and basically write it up and try to help people achieve their goals, whether it's getting bigger, stronger, leaner, performing better. So we don't want research to seem like this scary thing that is completely inaccessible and difficult to understand. But we also don't want people to kind of stumble into it and blindly accept everything they see in a research paper as fact. So, you asked, what is research? What is its role? Unfortunately, the answer to all of that is extremely nuanced. And we've kind of tried to make it our life's work to kind of fight through that nuance every day when we wake up and spend the whole day working. So hopefully, if you're interested in research and our perspectives on it, there's a million ways to find us. Some of them are free, some of them aren't. But in any case, we sincerely appreciate any support that we get, and we hope that what we do is helpful.
Hey guys, thank you very much for listening to this episode. I hope you give us a review or you really enjoyed the episode. Let me know any feedback. I'm always open to any criticism, anything like that. Reach out to me on Instagram at James_Walsham, or if you'd like to follow my business account, follow at the Hypertrophy Hub. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you would like to help the show, there's a list of ways to do so in the show notes, but if you're wondering how, the best thing to do is just give us a review on iTunes or just let me know how the show can be improved. Thank you very much.